Everybody to today's tutorial video. My name is Scott Macmillan. I'm the project lead for the IHSS benchmark dashboard. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to reformat your incident data in Excel using Power Query, which is a function within the Excel in the Microsoft 365 version. Unfortunately, if you do not have Microsoft 365, then your Excel likely does not have Power Query, in which case you'll have to use one of the other videos that we've recorded that will show you how to do that in a bit of a more manual process. But let's proceed here. So we're going to look at how to reformat it using Power Query. If your data, if the reporting system that you use, when you export it into Excel, if it is not in the format required for the benchmark dashboard, then you're going to need to reformat it. And that's what we're going to look at today. But before we do the reformatting, let's first take a look at and understand what format it needs to be in. So what you see here is a sample of data that would be provided to the benchmark dashboard in the format that's required. And you'll notice that it's in an Excel. It's got columns and rows. And if you're not familiar with the benchmark dashboard, what is required in terms of data from your system, we want the facility name, the report number, the incident category, the date, the time, the department, unit, area, or program of where that incident occurred in the facility, as well as the workplace violence typology and whether or not law enforcement was involved. In other words, did you have to call external law enforcement to come to the facility to support you in managing that particular incident? Now, if you do not have a dedicated data field, like a drop-down or checkbox in your system to capture these two, that's okay. If you don't capture it, then obviously you're not expected to provide data for it. The thing to point out with the format required for the benchmark dashboard is that each row needs to be a single category. And that would allow us to do a count on the individual categories that you have. And in turn allows us to create benchmarks on each one of those individual categories. So today we're going to look at how to reformat your data if your data combines categories into a single column. Okay, so for example, if your reporting system allows you to capture more than one category for an individual report, we need for those to be separated into their own rows. So if I scroll in here, zoom in a little bit, and you can see within these two rows that are highlighted red, the same report number is repeated. That's because this report actually contains two different categories. It contains an aggression category, and it also contains a patient restraint category. By having them separated, we can count those separate. With that in mind, understanding where we need to get to, let's take a look at an example of data that is not in this format, that is in a very particular format, that we can now reformat and recode. So I'm going to switch over to a sample data set. This data is similar to data, the output from a commonly used incident reporting system, which allows you to capture multiple categories for a report. Unfortunately, it combines those categories into a single row, which is why you'll notice if you went down the list here, you will never see the same report number repeated. And that's because everything is put into one row. In this particular reporting system, it actually allows you to identify a single category as being the primary incident type for that incident, which is contained in column C. There can only be one category per report. So this particular column is not necessarily an issue for us because it only contains one category. The challenge for us with this particular format is that all of the other categories involved in the incident are all lumped together in one column, column D. And we can see that, for example, in this third report. We can see that this report number 3 actually contains 3 different categories. It contains escort patient, which is the primary, But it also contains two additional categories. It contains property search, and it contains aggression, simple assault. And we can see that those are separated by a comma. And that comma is going to be very important in one of our later steps. So the goal for us is we need to convert this row into 3 rows so that each row represents one of these 3 categories. That will conform to the format that we just saw in the earlier Word document, which is how the benchmark dashboard needs it to be in. So that is what we're going to focus on today. Now, if your reporting system does it similar to this, but maybe doesn't lump them all in one column in D, perhaps when you export your data from your reporting system, it might have one category per column, in which case you could have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, however many categories your system allows you to attach to a single report. Each of those could be their own column. That would be a slightly different function of reformatting, which we'll look at in a different video, okay? So this video is very particular to this particular output format where you've got a primary category as a single category, and then you have all of the others together in one column D. So how do we reformat that? We're going to first start by highlighting all of our data. I like to do it so that I only get the rows and columns that have data. So I start by clicking on the very first cell, which is cell A1. I hold Shift and the Control button, and then I click on the right arrow on my directional keypad, which will highlight only the columns that have something in the header, i.e. in row 1. This will prevent it from highlighting column H and onwards, which are all blank. I don't need all those. Continuing to hold Shift and Control, I'm now going to push down on the directional pad. That's now going to highlight all the rows that actually contain some kind of data. That will avoid including rows 370 onwards, which would all be blank and we don't need. Now that we've got this highlighted, what we're going to do is at the top here, you have different options in Excel. We're going to use the data option. So we're going to click on that. And then on the left-hand side, there's this function called from table/range. We're going to click on that. And it's going to simply pop up here saying, are you sure this is the range of data that you want, which is exactly the range I've highlighted. I'm going to say yes. You also want to make sure that this My Table has headers is clicked, because it does. Headers refers to that first row where the column names are, and we're going to click OK. That's now going to analyze the data, and what it does is it opens up essentially a separate page with a copy of our original data. So we're not actually working off the original data right now. We're working off a copy of it until we finalize what we want it to do. And you'll notice that it says Power Query Editor. So again, this only works if you are using Microsoft 365. So the first step that we need to do is we need to separate column D. Column D is called additional incident types. This is where those multiple categories are all put together in one cell, as we can see here in row 3. This one cell actually has 2 categories. We need those to be separated. We don't have to worry about the primary incident column because it only does contain 1 category per cell. So how do we separate this column? We're going to highlight it by clicking on the top. We're going to right click, and we have all of these options. We want to split the column. We want to separate it. And then it has lots of options on the right hand side. The option we want is by delimiter. So we're going to click on delimiter. Now the system wants to know, well, what symbol or character do I need to know is the point at which your 2 categories need to be separated? And if you remember earlier, we noticed that in this particular data set from this particular incident reporting system, they use a comma in theirs. And if I move this out of the way, again, just putting it right underneath row 3, we can see that there. There's a comma that separates property search from aggression. So we're going to click the arrow and see if comma is one of the default options. And it is, which is excellent. That's great. Now, if your reporting system doesn't have a comma, it uses something else. If it's not one of these default ones, you can simply use custom, and then you can type in the character or symbol that it uses. But we know that our data set uses a comma, so we're going to click on comma, and we're going to hit OK. What that has done is it's turned this column into a bunch of new columns to the right. And it does it based off of how many categories are contained in a single cell with the commas. And in this case, we can see that we've gone from one column, we've got now two, column 3, we scroll to the right, we've got column 4 and column 5. So that tells me that in the original data, when it was all in one column, there was a report that actually contained 5 different incident categories in one cell as additional categories. Excel automatically creates the number of columns that is necessary based off of the data that you have, which is very excellent. It's a lot easier for us. The next step is we now need to highlight all of these 5 columns, and we need to perform a function called trim. If you're not familiar with trim, what trim does is it essentially removes any unneeded and essentially invisible spaces within the cells. Because what happens is when we delimit on a comma, the space that comes after the comma and right before the first letter of the category, that space is actually still there when we separate it, and we don't want that space to be there because it can actually cause problems with the mapping. Excel is very smart in a lot of respects, but it's kind of dumb in that sense because it treats that space as a character, no different than if there was an actual letter or number there. So we need to remove that unwanted and essentially kind of invisible character. So to do that, we've highlighted all of our columns. We simply right-click. We go down to about midway where it says transform. It brings up some options, and about midway down this list is trim, and we're going to click on that. And that's it. It's now removed all of those little spaces that were at the beginning of the different category labels from column 2 through column 5 that we don't need. Now we're ready to actually separate these into their own row. But to do that, we first need to add in our primary column because that is an important column. It does contain categories. We want to make sure that those are also included when we reformat these. So with these columns highlighted, we're going to right-click. And towards the bottom, there's these 3 options called unpivot. We want to unpivot only on the selected columns, which is the last option there. So we're going to click on that. What that has done is it's now gone from having 6 columns to putting them all into one column called value. All of our categories are now in one column. But more than that, they're also all in their own row. And we can see that when we go back to the beginning here, we can see that now we've got these report numbers that are duplicated. And that's because now each row represents a category, which is fantastic. So we're almost there. That's the key part that we wanted, but there's just a couple of other steps we need to do to kind of clean things up a little bit. The first thing we need to do is we need to get rid of this extra column. When we did that unpivot function, Excel adds in this new column called attribute, which basically identifies whether or not the row and the categories was the primary or was it an additional one. In other words, was it from column C originally or was it from column D? We don't need this. And in fact, it's going to cause us problems in one of the later steps where we need to actually remove rows that are actually duplicates of one another. We can't do that if we keep this in there because this is going to, it's no longer a duplication if each row has a different assigned type to it. So we need to get rid of this. So we're going to simply right click and remove. And it'll make more sense in a second here. So now that we've removed that, the next step is we want to filter out all these blanks, because these are essentially duplications as well. Um, this particular report only had a primary, but it's adding in an extra row even though there was nothing in that other column D. So we need to get rid of those. So we're going to highlight the column. We're going to click on the arrow, which brings up filter options. And the very first one is blank. We want to uncheck that. We don't want to include blanks in our data. And we're going to hit OK. Now we've got one row with a corresponding category. We've got reports that are duplicated, like row 2 and 3, both belong to report number 2, which is great. That's telling us that there was not just a primary category, but there was also an additional category added to it as well. So that's excellent. However, there's one last step that we need to do to clean this up. If we look at row 2 and 3, we notice that not only are they the same report number that we saw, row number 2, but they also happen to have the same category. That means, unfortunately, the author of this report put the primary category as escort, but then they also added the exact same category as additional. And because they are now separated into their own row, they're now being treated as separate, but they're not. They're actually a duplication. There should not have been the same category put as both primary and additional. So we need to remove this and any other ones that are similar to this. So to do that, we just need to highlight all of our data again, because we want to make sure that we're removing duplicates across all of the different columns. So we're going to highlight that. We're going to right click, and there's a function right there called remove duplicates. We're going to click on that. And what we should expect to see is report number 2 should now go from 2 report number 2s down to 1. And that is exactly what happened. There is now only 1 report number of 2 because the other one was removed as a duplicate. And that's where, if we had kept that in column called attribute that was added automatically, it wouldn't have removed it. It wouldn't have identified those as being duplicates by virtue of the fact that one was listed as primary and the other one listed as additional. That difference is enough that it would not have been identified as a duplication. That's why we had to remove that other extra column. And that is all that is required in terms of the steps to reformatting it. Now the data is exactly in the format that we want. The last thing that we need to do is actually run this and run these steps against the original data. And I say steps because you'll notice on the right-hand side here, that's exactly what Power Query does. It lists in chronological order exactly those different steps that we took, which is really excellent. It helps us to understand what we did. So now that we've done that, we're ready to go. We're going to go up on the left here, and we are going to close and load. We're going to close this editor, and it's going to apply all of these steps to our actual data, and we'll see what happens. And this is the final reformatted data. So we've now gone from one tab, which had the original data. Now we've got an additional data tab, that now has our revised data to it. And we can see, for example, that there's only 1 report 2 here, as we saw, but if we scroll down, we'll probably find reports that are duplicated, like this here. Row 30, 31, and 32 are all report 27, and each one has a unique category attached to it, which is exactly what we want. Also notice over here, you'll notice that there's 500 rows. Our original data, if we highlight one column here, just close this, we can see actually had 369. So that's another evidence of how it worked, our reformatting process worked, because we should expect to have more data and more rows now that we've reformatted those multiple categories in one row into their own row. So this final data set now contains a total of 508 rows, which is great. And that's it, folks. That's how to reformat your data if the output from your reporting system has two columns, a primary, and then an additional column that has multiple categories in a single cell. This is how you reformat it into the format that's required. You can now save this, and this will be the data set that you will use to upload into the benchmark dashboard moving forward. I hope that helped, ladies and gentlemen. If you have any follow-up questions or concerns, please reach out to myself or the IHSS, and we're here to help. And good luck.